AP 120, Chapter 7, Topics, Bone Structure and Histology. So, bones are very active living tissues. They are moist, they are dynamic, and of course they are important. And each individual bone is an organ. That's a lot of organs. So what is an organ? A, collection of cells working together. B, two or more tissues working together. C, groups of epithelial cells that secrete hormones. Or D, none of the above. Well, I hope you said it was B. That's right. Two or more tissues working together for a common purpose makes up a organ. And there are more than two tissues in bones. You have, of course, the bone tissue itself. There is cartilage, there's dense connective tissue, there's, of course, blood vessels, nerves, uh, lots of different kinds of tissues incorporated in the bone organ. All right, some functions of bones, some possible functions of bones. Well, they're kind of similar to the functions of the skeletal system. So we have a site for muscle attachment. As we can see in this picture here, a muscle is attaching to the bone. It's because the bone is needed as a rigid structure to allow for movement to be curved from it being pulled on. Protection and support of soft tissues, holding those tissues and organs in place, protecting them from external forces, all important functions. Blood cell production, all of our blood cells are produced in red bone marrow. And storage of inorganic salts, specifically calcium salts. So there are four structurally defined categories of bones. We have the flat bones. Flat bones are thin, sort of like a sandwich, although they can be curved or shaped in slightly different ways. They are overall relatively flat, like a pancake. Long bones. Long bones are much longer than they are wide. They have this large shaft in the middle. Lots of long bones in the body. Short bones. Short bones are more blocky, say sort of as wide as they are tall, but to be honest, their shapes can vary a lot, but again, it's just sort of blocky in shape. Find them mainly in the ankles and wrists. And then irregular bones, the catch-all category for things that just don't quite fit in the other three, have really odd shapes. So the vertebral column, big classic example of this. Flat, long, short, irregular. All right, so when we have a long bone, for instance, and this is the femur, we'll notice certain structures that you'll find in pretty much all long bones and many of these structures in any bone. So to start with, you can break the long bone up into three chunks. You can get the proximal epiphysis, the diaphysis or shaft, and then the distal epiphysis. So proximal and distal epiphyses and the diaphysis, the shaft in the middle. Also, you see in the epiphyses, you see what are called epiphyseal plates. If it's in children, epiphyseal lines, if it's in adults. We also see that the bone tissue found in the long bone includes spongy bone tissue, which, well, looks kind of like a sponge with lots of opening crevices. And then compact bone tissue. And the compact bone tissue is on the outside toward the surface of the bone. The spongy bone, wherever it's located, is more deep, more internal. And then, of course, you can have some spaces with no bone tissue. So spongy bone tissue primarily at the ends and inside, deeper in the bone. Compact bone tissue toward the outside, more superficial. And is very dense, doesn't have all these empty spaces. All right, you also have within the diaphysis this space referred to as the medullary cavity. This helps make the bone lighter overall, very important. Of course, spaces within the bone are seldom empty, so here the medullary cavity is filled with yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow, primarily adipose tissue, so it is a place where we can store triglycerides. And then all these empty spaces, these nooks and crannies in the spongy bone tissue, they are where you'll find red bone marrow. And red bone marrow, very important because it is where all blood cells are produced. And the production of blood cells is known as hematopoiesis, production of blood cells. And red bone marrow is indeed red. All right, we find also other structures associated with the bone at the smooth ends of bones where they come together to form joints. We will find cartilage, articular cartilage, and that is a hyaline cartilage to be exact. So it helps to make sure those moving areas move smoothly with little friction. Then we find lying everywhere else on the surface of the bone tissue is a sheet of tissue called periosteum. Periosteum made up of dense connective tissue. Also, we find a lot of the functional bone cells. And then lining the inside of the bone, lining the medullary cavity and all those nooks and crannies, that is covered in endosteum. Endosteum, also dense connective tissue. So we have tissue on the outside, periosteum, and the inside, endosteum. And then the epiphyseal plates found in children are also made of hyaline cartilage. And when that cartilage calcifies and becomes more bony tissue, then it's called an epiphyseal line, and that is what is found in adults, epiphyseal lines. Here is just a cross-section of the diaphysis of a long bone. Again, on toward the surface, superficial is the dense compact bone. Internal, deeper is the spongy bone. All right, bone wedge. So in this model, it's like we took a chunk, a wedge chunk of the diaphysis of a long bone. So we can see the periosteum toward the surface, lying on the surface of the bone tissue. You can't see it, but the endosteum would be on the inside, lining all these nooks and crannies. We've got the more superficial compact bone, the more deep spongy bone. We also see this reoccurring structure. It's seen here and here, made up of lots of concentric rings. That structure is called an osteon. Osteons are the basic structural unit of compact bones. So again, in compact bone, we see it again and again and again and again. Now, in the center of the osteon is an open space called the central canal. And within the central canal are blood vessels and nerves, important for keeping bone tissue healthy. So here we can see a central canal that's been cut in half. We can see the blood vessels and nerves running along the length of the bone, top to bottom. Now, if we take a close-up look of the bone tissue, we see that there's these little spaces. These little spaces are called lacuna, one lacuna, many lacunae. And within these little spaces are osteocytes. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that help to maintain the bone tissue. And we also see that there's these little connecting tubes going between the lacuna and going from the lacuna toward the central canal. And these are called canaliculus for one, or canaliculi for many. So the canaliculus is a space connecting bone cells. You can see the bone cells have little processes going through them. And also connecting the bone cells to the central canal so nutrients can reach the bone cells and waste can go to the central canal where the blood vessels are. So again, in this image, all those dark little dots would be the lacuna with the osteocytes, and those squiggly lines are the canaliculi. All right. We also notice, looking at the bone wedge model, that there are tunnels or canals going along the width of the bone, and those are referred to as perforating canals. So they're carrying blood vessels and nerves along the width of the bone. And then also each of these sheets that are the concentric circles for the osteon, each one of those sheets of bone tissue referred to as a lamella. So each thin sheet of bone tissue helping to form the bone is referred to as lamella. So you have lots of concentric lamellas making up the osteon. All right, here of course is a little bit of spongy bone tissue. Spongy bone tissue lined with the endosteum has plenty of spaces where blood vessels and nerves can intertwine with the bone tissue. You do not see osteons in spongy bone tissue. There is no osteons in spongy bone tissue. And so these little connecting structures, these girders, as it were, are often called trabeculae. So compact bone tissue has osteons made up of lamellae. Spongy bone tissue have trabeculae. All right, bone cells. Bone cells are important for the function of bone. We have the osteoprogenitor cells. These are the bone stem cells. When they grow and divide, they produce osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are very important. Osteoblasts are the cells that deposit the bony matrix that make up the external material of the bone, the external matrix. And then that external material becomes calcified with the calcium salts. So osteoblasts build up the bone tissue. We also have osteoclasts. Osteoclasts, their job is to break down the bony matrix. They destroy the extracellular matrix of the bone. And this will both remove that material, cutting down the bone, osteoclasts cut down, and also releasing calcium, sending that calcium to the bloodstream usually. And the functions of the osteoblasts and osteoclasts are constantly occurring. And this process of building up and breaking down bone tissue is known as bone remodeling. So this is occurring all the time, and I think something like every 11 years, all of our bone tissue has been replaced. It is newish. All right. When the osteoblasts build up and form the extracellular material of bones, they will get trapped within the bone tissue, and then they will find themselves in a lacuna, and then the osteoblasts will differentiate, will turn into osteocytes. Osteocytes are the mature bone cells found in the bone tissue, and they help to maintain that bone tissue, keep the bone tissue healthy. All right, and that is it for this part of Chapter 7.